All right, let's dive in. Today we're heading back to ancient Sumer.
Sumer, always a fascinating place to explore.
But we're not just doing the typical greatest hits this time, right? You gave me this really intriguing stack of scholarly excerpts to prep for our deep dive. It looks like we're going way beyond Sumer 101. We've got legal and social structures, religious beliefs, even some intense linguistic analysis. It's like a full-on Sumerian buffet.
It does seem like you're after a more well-rounded picture of Sumerian civilization, not just the usual highlights.
Exactly. So where do we even start with all this?
Well, a good place to begin might be with a key figure in Sumerian studies, Thorkild Jacobsen. You actually have his bibliography in those sources you mentioned?
Thorkild Jacobsen, okay. What makes him so important? Fill me in.
Well, he started publishing way back in 1927. By the late 1930s, early 40s, he was considered like a leading Assyriologist.
Wow, so he was a real pioneer in the field.
Definitely. But what's really interesting is his approach. He didn't see Sumerian civilization as just some ancient, dusty relic.
He didn't.
No. He thought that by understanding these people and their culture, we could gain valuable insights into our own lives today. Culturally, spiritually, you name it.
That's a really cool perspective. I like where this is going already.
Oh, and there's more. The bibliography also mentions something called the Danish tradition as a major influence on Jacobsen's work.
The Danish tradition. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one.
Well, think of it like a group of scholars. These scholars were using their intuition and observation to uncover hidden meanings in ancient texts.
So like cultural detectives.
Yeah, exactly. Scholars like Johannes Pedersen and Wilhelm Grembeck were big proponents of this. They believed that even small details could reveal deeper cultural and religious significance.
So they weren't just taking the text at face value, they were reading between the lines.
Exactly. And this unique approach really influenced how Jacobsen interpreted Sumerian culture. He was able to uncover all these hidden meanings and connections that other scholars might missed.
I can already see why Jacobsen is such a big deal. Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. We have some excerpts from this ancient Mesopotamian text called Maklu.
Yes, my clue.
And it sounds pretty intense. From what I gathered, it describes an ancient witchcraft trial.
Yes. Legal proceedings against those accused of witchcraft.
Whoa, okay, so like ancient Sumerian witch hunts. Were they anything like the Salem witch trials, you know, the ones we always hear about?
Not quite. The Maklu trial had this very specific framework. It really emphasized the legalistic nature of the proceedings.
So even though it was about witchcraft, they still had a formal process. Interesting.
Very much so. We're talking judgment, execution.
Yeah.
It was a very structured process for dealing with what they considered a serious threat.
That's pretty surprising. I didn't realize they had such formalized legal procedures for something like witchcraft. I guess I always pictured it as a lot more chaotic.
It just goes to show how seriously they took it in ancient Mesopotamia. The Maklu text outlines two main methods for dealing with witches. One involved killing and destroying the body to keep the spirit out of the netherworld.
Okay, that's one way to deal with it. Intense. What was the other method?
The second involved burial and consigning the witch's spirit to the netherworld.
So two very different approaches. What do you think led to that shift?
It's hard to say for sure, but the second method, the burial one, it might have been influenced by exorcist practices that were becoming more common around that time.
So instead of total annihilation, they were trying to control the spirits.
Something like that.
Yeah.
It seems like they're thinking about how to handle these perceived threats evolved over time.
Fascinating stuff. It makes you wonder if there are any parallels between how they dealt with witches and other aspects of their society.
You know, there might be. Remember those Assyrian loyalty oaths we talked about before?
You mean the ones with the Mamitu curse attached to them?
Exactly. That curse, it bound people to the king and threatened them with, well, total destruction if they betrayed him.
Wow, high stakes.
Seriously. It's almost as if both those who broke loyalty oaths and those accused of witchcraft were seen as breaking a fundamental social contract.
So breaking your word, whether to the king or through witchcraft, had some serious repercussions.
Absolutely. It seems like maintaining social order was extremely important to the ancient Sumerians.
I'm getting that sense. All right, let's shift gears a bit. We have some excerpts about the Atrahasis epic, specifically its opening lines, and they've caused quite a stir among scholars, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. It's like trying to solve a giant puzzle. There's been a lot of debate about the meaning of certain phrases, the roles of different deities, even the overall message behind the epic's beginning.
Creation myths are always so captivating, though. What makes the Atrahasis epic stand out?
Well, it's full of puns and wordplay. It uses language in really clever ways to convey deeper meanings. For example, there's a play on the word Awilu, which means man, and the god Aila.
Irilu and Waela. Okay, I can see how that could be a pun.
Right, it's like a built-in cosmic dad joke.
Yeah.
And it suggests this link between man's creation and the very origin of his name.
So it's not just a straightforward creation story. There are all these layers of meaning baked in.
Exactly. And on top of that, the epic plays with the usual power dynamic between gods and humans.
How so?
Well, in a lot of Mesopotamian myths, gods are all powerful, and humans are, well, pretty much subservient.
Right, that's the typical setup.
But in the Atrahasis epic, right from the beginning, it challenges that. It hints at a much more complex relationship, like maybe humans aren't as powerless as we think.
Ooh, I like a good power dynamic shakeup. Okay, from creation myths to something a bit more tangible. We have some excerpts focusing on the Sumerian perception of the Zagros Mountains.
Ah, yes, the Zagros Mountains.
So we're going from the cosmos to the mountains. What did those mountains represent to the Sumerians?
To them, they were a place of danger and desolation, the opposite of the order and comfort of their cities. In their myths, the Zagros Mountains were actually formed from the remains of dead stone warriors.
Whoa, that's a pretty hardcore origin story for a mountain range.
Right. It's this constant reminder of chaos and the untamed world lurking just beyond the edges of their civilization.
I wonder if they had any adventurous types who dared to explore them, like ancient Sumerian mountaineers.
Oh, they certainly had travelers and messengers who would brave those treacherous paths. In fact, we have excerpts from a poem called Lugelbanda in the Mountain Cave. It's about this guy, Lugelbanda, who finds himself lost and alone in the mountains.
Yikes. Alone in the mountains, that doesn't sound good.
Not at all. He laments the lack of family, community. It really emphasizes that stark divide between the civilized world of Sumer and the wild, untamed wilderness of the Zagros.
It's amazing how different cultures interpret the same landscape, isn't it? We might look at a mountain range and see beauty, maybe a challenge to climb, but for them, it was a reminder of the forces they couldn't control.
Exactly. And that sense of the untamed encroaching upon civilization.
Yeah.
It even popped up in some excerpts about gardens, which you'd think would be like the opposite of those harsh mountains.
Gardens, huh? So even in their peaceful gardens, they couldn't escape the untamed world.
It seems not. There's this description of a gardener named Sukalituda. And poor Sukalituda, his work is constantly being disrupted by sudden dust storms.
Oh, no, not the dust storms.
Even in their cultivated spaces, they felt vulnerable to nature's power. Like it could disrupt their order at any moment.
I guess you can't escape Mother Nature, even in ancient Sumer. Okay, speaking of chaos and order, let's talk about Gilgamesh. We've got some excerpts about him, but it seems like there are some differences in how he's portrayed in Sumerian versus Akkadian traditions.
Yes, good catch. Gilgamesh's character went through quite an evolution over time.
So how is he different in those early Sumerian texts?
Well, in a Sumerian poem called Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, he's a much harsher figure, more of a tyrant, really. Yeah. He oppresses the people of Uruk, forces them into labor, exploits them. And there's no mention of this whole sexual awakening or quest for immortality that we see in later Akkadian versions.
It sounds like the Sumerians had a much darker view of him.
Definitely. He's less of a hero and more of a cautionary tale.
Interesting. So then the Akkadians basically gave him a makeover.
Well, in a way, yes. They transformed him into this hero on a journey of self-discovery, someone grappling with big questions about life and death.
Makes you wonder what prompted that shift, doesn't it? Were the Akkadians trying to soften his image, or did their whole understanding of heroism change? Lots to ponder there, but I think we need to take a quick breather.
Good idea.
We've covered so much ground already. Creation myths, mountains, ancient legal systems. When we come back, we'll dig into a hymn dedicated to the goddess Inanna, and then we'll see how some of these ancient Sumerian concepts connect with something a bit more familiar, biblical texts.
All right, so remember that fragmented hymn dedicated to Inanna we mentioned before. Let's see if we can piece together some insights about her from what we have.
Sounds like we're dealing with another one of those ancient Sumerian jigsaw puzzles. What clues do we have?
Even with some pieces missing. It's clear Inanna was a powerful goddess, that's for sure. The hymn hints at her connection to abundance, purity, luxuriance.
Okay, so even in its fragmented state, we're still getting a sense of her importance. It's like trying to reconstruct a mosaic. Even with some tiles missing, you can still see the artistry.
That's a great analogy. It really is amazing what we can learn from these ancient texts, even when they're, not complete.
For sure. Okay, now we're moving on to something that kind of bridges the gap between ancient Sumer and something a bit more familiar, biblical Psalms.
Right, biblical Psalms.
And there's this focus on the relationship between nature and piety, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind that nature, in the biblical context, it refers to God's creation, viewed through this lens of faith and reverence. It doesn't necessarily have those same systematic or intellectual connotations as it does for us today.
Gotcha. So it's more about experiencing nature through a spiritual lens. Okay, our notes highlight Psalm 8 as a prime example of this interplay. What makes this particular psalm stand out?
Well, Psalm 8, it's fascinating because it reflects this tension between two different perspectives. On one hand, you have the traditional wisdom view of nature, the idea that nature is this source of divine knowledge.
Okay, so that's one side of it. What's the other?
On the other hand, there's this newer emphasis on Torah-based piety.
Mm-hmm.
And the poet, he seems to be kind of wrestling with these two ideas, trying to reconcile them.
Almost like trying to fit two different puzzle pieces together, even if they don't quite seem to belong.
Yeah, exactly. And to explore this tension, the poet uses some really unique imagery. Like, for example, there's this idea of children's babble being a form of praise to God.
Children's babble. That's a pretty unique way to think about praise.
Right. And then there's this other striking image, this image of humanity being crowned with glory and majesty.
Yeah.
Almost as if God is sharing his royal power with humans.
Wow, that's powerful imagery. It definitely seems like the poet is reimagining some traditional themes in a really new way.
Definitely. And it suggests this really deep reflection on, the relationship between humanity, God, and the created world. And this internal struggle, it continues in Psalm 19. In this one, the poet, he seems to be grappling with the silence of nature.
The silence of nature.
Yeah, contrasted with this revealed word of Torah. It's as if he's yearning for a spiritual wholeness that can encompass both the natural world and the divine law.
It makes you wonder, does he see those two things as like inherently at odds with each other? Or is he searching for a way to bridge the gap?
That's a great question, and I think that's the question Psalm 19 is really trying to explore.
And honestly, it's a question that still resonates with us today. How do we find meaning in both the natural world and our systems of belief? How do we reconcile the awe-inspiring beauty of nature with the, moral guidance we find in our faiths?
Big questions.
Yeah.
All right, let's shift gears again. We had some excerpts here about marriage in old Babylonian society, and there's this term, inchoate marriage, that I've never heard before.
Inchoate marriage. Yeah, that one's new to me, too. It sounds like it might be a bit more complicated than just saying, I do.
Oh, you can say that again. Inchoate marriage refers to the fact that marriage in old Babylonian society, it wasn't just a single event like it is for us today.
It wasn't.
Nope. It was a multi-stage process. Kind of like a relationship status, constantly updating on social media, right? You've got the deliberative stage, then the prenuptial stage, the nuptial stage, and finally the familial stage.
Wow, so it was a whole journey.
Oh, yeah. It was a big deal.
Yeah.
And each step had its own legal and social implications, especially when it came to things like property rights.
So it wasn't just about love and commitment. It sounds like they were pretty pragmatic about the whole thing.
It was definitely as much about social and economic stability as it was about romantic love, that's for sure.
Makes sense. Our notes also mention an example of an oil divination ritual used in that deliberative stage. What was that all about?
So basically, before anyone even considered a proposal, they'd consult the gods for guidance. And they'd use this ritual with oil. They'd cast a drop of oil for the man and another for the woman.
Okay, and then what?
If the drops merged together, that was seen as a good sign, like the gods were giving their blessing. But if the drops stayed apart or one was, disrupted, bad omen, potential trouble ahead.
Whoa, so they were looking for any signs they could get.
They were. Marriage was a big deal back then. It had lasting implications for families and communities.
It definitely wasn't something to be taken lightly. All right, speaking of taking things seriously, we also have some information about the marriage pact, or Rik Sadam. This wasn't just a casual agreement to get married someday. It was a legally binding document, right?
Absolutely. We're talking serious commitment here.
And our notes say it was often accompanied by a ritual drinking of bride ale. Was this like their version of a bachelor or bachelorette party?
Maybe. But it was more than just a party, for sure. It marked a crucial step in formalizing the marriage, a step beyond a simple engagement.
Okay, so more official than a casual get-together.
Much more. And these pacts, they could take different forms. Some involved bride wealth, others didn't. It really depended on the families involved, their social status, all that.
So lots of different ways to go about it, but always with a legal document.
It seems so. It really highlights the complexities of their social structures.
Definitely not as simple as it might seem at first glance.
Not at all. And even after the ceremony, the pact, all that, there was still a sense of incoteness.
Even after all that.
It's true. They would often use divination to figure out the best course of action for the newly married couple.
So they were constantly seeking guidance, even after tying the knot.
Constantly. It really emphasizes how central religion was to their lives. The gods weren't just these distant figures. They were intimately involved in even the most personal aspects of life.
Fascinating. Okay, moving on. We have some excerpts about a model court case from ancient Nippur. This one revolves around inheritance. What can we learn from this case about the legal system back then?
Model court cases, they're like ancient legal textbooks. They provide a glimpse into how legal proceedings worked, how evidence was presented, all of that.
Like watching an episode of Law and Order Sumer.
Exactly. In this particular case, it focuses on a property dispute related to inheritance. It shows us how the court played a role in resolving these conflicts.
Okay, so that's the legal side of it. But is there anything we can learn beyond just procedures?
Oh, absolutely. These model court cases, they reveal so much about social structures, family relationships, economic activity. It's a window into their whole world.
It's amazing how much we can learn from just one court case. Okay, this next excerpt, it's a bit of a head-scratcher. It's about Ningirsu, the male city god of Girsu. But get this, his name actually means Lady of Girsu.
Ah, yes, the case of the Lady of Girsu. It's definitely a bit of an enigma. And to make it even more puzzling, there's no evidence that Ningirsu had any female characteristics. He was depicted as a pretty masculine god of agriculture and warfare.
So why the feminine name? It's like if we had a king named Queen Elizabeth.
I know, right? One theory is that it reflects a shift in power dynamics over time. Some scholars think there might have been an earlier female deity, maybe Bao, who was originally the one associated with Girsu.
So as Ningirsu gained power, he kind of absorbed her title, even though he was definitely still a he.
It's possible. It highlights how fluid religious beliefs could be in ancient times. Okay, now we're going into some linguistics territory. There's an article about the Akkadian verb forms izuzum and itulum. This might get a little technical.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm fluent in ancient Akkadian grammar, but for those who are interested, what's the gist?
Well, it gets into this debate about whether these verbs are regular or irregular, even their possible origins. It really highlights how complex and challenging it is to try and understand ancient languages.
Especially when we're working with incomplete evidence, right?
Exactly. We're basically linguistic detectives trying to decipher a code from thousands of years ago. Okay, and we're back to Gilgamesh again. It looks like there are some significant differences in how this oppression of Uruk episode is depicted in Sumerian versus Akkadian versions.
Oh, yeah, the oppression of Uruk. We touched on that earlier, but now we're getting into the specifics. What are the key differences here?
In the Sumerian version, Gilgamesh's oppression, it's portrayed as impacting both men and women. He's forcing them into harsh labor, using them as pawns in this brutal game that involves a puku and a meku.
Puku and Meku, those don't sound like fun games.
They weren't. It seems like it was this violent competition, maybe connected to the cult of Ishtar.
Okay, so a pretty brutal affair. How does that compare to the Akkadian version?
Well, in the Akkadian epic, this oppression of Uruk, it takes on a different form. It shifts to these athletic and military contests among men. The puku game is still there, but it's more metaphorical.
So less about actual violence and more about power dynamics.
Exactly. It becomes this symbol of Gilgamesh's authority over the men of Uruk.
Interesting. So from a literal competition to a symbolic representation of power. Another example of how these stories evolved over time.
Okay, and we have a quick mention of a rare exorcistic fragment, but unfortunately it's pretty damaged.
Yeah, it's always frustrating when we have these tantalizing glimpses into their world, but not enough to get the full picture. Another incomplete puzzle. So what can we make out from what's left?
There are some intriguing details, like these repeated phrases, Nadu and Pana, and then there's an unusual writing of the sun god's name.
That's curious. But without more context, it's hard to draw any firm conclusions.
Definitely. But hey, it just underscores the importance of the work archaeologists and scholars do to piece together these fragments of the past.
For sure. Speaking of piecing things together, let's talk about those scribes from ancient Mari. They were the keepers of knowledge, weren't they? But it looks like their job wasn't always a walk in the park.
Not at all. These excerpts from their correspondence and documents, they really highlight the challenges they faced. I mean, managing communication networks, making sure information was accurately recorded and transmitted, all without the luxury of, spell check or email.
It sounds like the ancient equivalent of trying to manage an email inbox with endless reply all chains and people constantly seeing the wrong people.
Huh? Exactly. But their work was vital. They were responsible for everything from composing official letters to, keeping track of grain supplies to maintaining archives.
It's a lot of responsibility resting on those stylus-wielding shoulders.
It was. And it required serious skills.
Hmm.
Literacy, attention to detail, organization.
Talk about pressure.
Hmm?
And speaking of pressure, our notes mention examples of scribal errors and how those mistakes, even small ones, could sometimes have big consequences.
Oh, yeah. Those examples are a good reminder that even in the ancient world, communication was this complex and often messy process.
It's kind of comforting to know that they weren't perfect, Makes them feel more human.
Exactly. Okay, now we're going back to foundational myths. We have some excerpts about the Sumerian creation myth.
Creation myths, always a good time. What's the Sumerian version all about?
It's a classic story of order emerging from chaos. It describes the separation of heaven and earth, which creates the structure of the cosmos. And it uses a lot of symbolism, like, for instance, fragrant herbs and plants. They represent the ordered world.
Interesting. So even their plants had symbolic meaning.
It seems so. And there's this really striking image of heaven inseminating earth, which symbolizes the creation of life and cosmic harmony.
That's quite the image. It's incredible how these ancient myths, even though they're so old, still resonate with us today. I mean, we're still wrestling with those same big questions about order and chaos, creation, the origins of life.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to the epic tale of Lugalbanda. He's a hero who undergoes a pretty profound transformation.
We've got some notes here about liminal spaces as a key part of his journey. Can you explain what that means in this context?
Sure. Liminal spaces, think of them as thresholds, places of transition, ambiguity. And Lugalbanda's journey, it takes him through a series of these spaces, both literally and metaphorically. He's separated from his companions, he wanders alone in the wilderness, encounters these powerful creatures and deities. And these experiences, they really push him to his limits.
So it's the classic hero's journey, right? Venturing into the unknown, facing challenges, emerging transformed.
Exactly. And as Lugalbanda moves through these liminal spaces, he gains knowledge, abilities, even a deeper understanding of himself.
That makes sense. Our notes also mention parallels between Lugalbanda's journey and the characteristics of sainthood, which is intriguing. What are those parallels?
Well, think about it. He's chosen by the gods. He shows unwavering devotion. He communes with the divine. He gains these superhuman powers. Those are all elements often associated with sainthood.
Wow, Lugalbanda the saint. Who knew? Okay, and finally, we have an excerpt about one of the earliest known law codes, the Codex Urnama. But it sounds like it's in pretty rough shape.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
The Codex Urnama, or CU as it's often called, it survived in a pretty fragmentary state, which makes reconstructing it a real challenge. It's like putting together a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
So frustrating. But what can we learn from the pieces we do have?
Well, despite those challenges, the CU still gives us valuable insights into the legal, social, and economic aspects of Sumerian society under Urnama's rule.
Amazing that we can still learn so much from a law code that's thousands of years old. All right, so we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive. What are your key takeaways?
We've seen how complex and fascinating Sumerian civilization was. I mean, we're talking intricate legal systems, religious beliefs, literary traditions, even the challenges of their writing system.
It's been an incredible journey for sure. I'm really struck by the Codex Urnama. It's amazing to think that one of the earliest law codes, it still resonates with us today.
It really does, doesn't it? It gives us a window into their sense of justice, their values. I mean, they were dealing with things like theft, divorce, false accusation.
Issues that are still relevant to us today.
Exactly. It shows that some human concerns, they really are timeless.
We might not use oil divination anymore, but we're still grappling with those same fundamental questions of fairness, justice, how to create a society that works.
And that's what makes studying these ancient cultures so valuable. It's not just about memorizing historical facts. It's about understanding the human condition, the challenges we've faced and the different ways we've tried to overcome them throughout history.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one thing you'd like our listener to ponder?
How about this? Think about how our exploration of these Sumerian concepts, things like inchoate marriage or those Mamatu curses, how do they change our perspectives on our own social and legal systems? Do they challenge our assumptions?
It's like holding a mirror up to our own society, using the lens of the ancient past.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, we hope you enjoyed this Sumerian adventure as much as we did, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Welcome back to our Sumerian deep dive. It's really remarkable how much we can learn from a civilization that, existed so long ago.
It is. After going through all these excerpts, I'm struck by how relevant some of these ancient concepts still feel. We've explored everything from their creation myths to their legal systems, from their perceptions of the landscape to, like, the very words they used to communicate.
It's true, and some of those concepts, they really make you think, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Like those Mamitu curses, remember those? The ones that basically bound people to their oaths, but with this threat of utter destruction if they broke them.
Right, the Momotu curses. Powerful stuff.
It makes you wonder if that fear, the fear of those curses, if it actually made their society more stable or just created this atmosphere of, like, paranoia.
That's a fascinating question. Did those curses ensure that people kept their word, that agreements were honored, or did they just lead to a society where everyone was suspicious of each other?
Definitely something to think about. And speaking of social contracts, we also explored that fascinating concept of inchoate marriage, right? It's so different from our modern approach.
It really is.
I mean, we put so much emphasis on romantic love and that single ceremony I do, and it's done. But maybe there's something to be said for a more gradual process like the Sumerians had.
You think so?
Maybe. With their emphasis on family approval, social and economic compatibility, this gradual transition into, like, a fully recognized union.
Yeah, that's true. Their approach with those multiple stages and rituals, it definitely ensured that marriage was a carefully considered decision.
It wasn't just about two people, it involved families, even the wider community.
Exactly. They were building a solid foundation step by step.
And we can't forget about divination. I mean, they consulted the gods at practically every step of the marriage process.
Oh yeah, they were always seeking guidance.
It's a far cry from our modern world of, like, swiping right on a dating app.
Right. But it really shows how deeply intertwined religion was with every part of their lives, even something as personal as marriage.
Absolutely. Okay, and then there's Gilgamesh. We talked about him earlier, but I'm still fascinated by his evolution. He goes from this harsh ruler in the Sumerian texts to this hero on a quest for, well, basically immortality in the Akkadian epic.
It's quite the transformation.
What do you think that shift says about their culture, how it changed over time?
It's possible that it reflects shifting values. Maybe their ideas about heroism changed. Maybe the Akkadians saw something admirable in this quest for immortality, this yearning for knowledge and transcendence.
Or maybe they just wanted to make him a little more relatable.
That's possible too.
And it wasn't just Gilgamesh who evolved, right? We saw how even their myths and religious beliefs, they changed over time too.
Openly.
Like Ningirsu, the male god whose name literally means Lady of Girsu. It's wild.
It really highlights the fluidity of their belief system. Their pantheon wasn't static. It was constantly evolving.
Even the gods weren't set in stone, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay, and before we wrap up, I have to give a shout out to the scribes. Those guys were the unsung heroes.
They really were.
I mean, they weren't out there fighting battles or ruling kingdoms, but they were the keepers of knowledge, meticulously preserving everything on those clay tablets.
Their work was crucial for maintaining order, for making sure their society functioned smoothly.
They were the original information architects, and they did it all without spell check or email. Imagine that.
I can't even imagine. And those excerpts really highlighted how challenging their work was. All those revisions, potential errors, just the sheer volume of information they had to manage.
Yeah, real MVPs right there.
And let's not forget about all those fragments, the pieces of myths, rituals, legal texts that, well, they offer us these glimpses into their world, but also leave us with so many questions.
It's like we're constantly on the verge of a breakthrough, but then hit a dead end. So frustrating, but also kind of exciting,
I know what you mean. It fuels our curiosity.
So as we finish up our Sumerian deep dive, what's, like, one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
How about this? Keep exploring. Don't be afraid to, Dig deeper, ask questions, challenge your assumptions about the past, and honestly, even about the present.
Because the ancient world, it's not just about dusky relics, right? It's full of insights that can help us understand ourselves better.
That's what makes this stuff so fascinating.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this Sumerian adventure.
My pleasure. Always a good time.
And to everyone listening, we hope you enjoyed our deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another exciting exploration.